All right, I'm gonna start. Thank you. All right, so I'm gonna hop around to some of the questions. How do you create consistent content to produce daily, even with sports being out of season? So how do you always create content, and what are some tips that you could give for content creation?
Well, God bless the NFL and God bless the fact that I live in an NFL city. The NFL has done a masterful job of making itself a 365-day a year event. Every day there's something news value oriented. I don't think you have to hunt too hard for content if you live in an NFL city. Maybe in June. Maybe in May, June, and early July, that there's a little bit of a lull, but even then you start to get into mini camps and you get into OTAs and things of that sort. So I think the smartest thing to do when it comes to, at least from a print perspective, is maybe to, as Mike Tomlin has been known to say on a few occasions, squirrel away a few nuts, have some feature piece ideas, have some long form interviews, some evergreen material that, you come across, say, at draft time, or, you stumble across in spring training that you think might be a good feature story later in the year, at the end of the hockey playoffs that you want to hold for the next season. And when things get slow in the summertime, dot that in. I think it's always smart to think about what you can incubate for later, even if it's good now, that might have a better impact and a better result for you as a writer, as a broadcaster, to roll out at maybe a quieter time.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to one of the first things that you said, having a diversification of different sorts of skill sets. Can you talk a little bit about, from your experience, going in and out of different sorts of mediums, as far as, writing, podcasting, being, on air on the X or on radio? Can you talk a little bit about your experiences, kind of like navigating each of those mediums?
Yeah, you mean just how you kind of approach being on air for different functions? Is that what you're getting at?
How you got into it? How do you prepare for it? How do you have all of those things, simultaneously? So how did you kind of get into each one of those mediums, and how do you prepare for it?
Well, I think, there's a general platform from which any and all performance launches. There's a confidence, there's writing, there's delivery, there's understanding the entertainment element of whatever it is you are presenting, because in all forms, we're trying to entertain the audience, captivate the audience, hold the audience. You just have to have an appreciation that will permeate anything you do, whether you're turning out a 30-second voicer from election coverage on an NPR station like I did when I was 22, or you're hosting a Steelers post-game show on the Steelers radio network when, I was 40, or, doing a Guy Talk morning show on the X when I was 35. There's a platform from which you have to understand, how are you going to connect to your audience? You have to appreciate the audience and how you're trying to reach them. My goals as a performer, quote unquote, turning around a city council meeting in Syracuse, New York, when I was 21 years old for an NPR station, that function is very different, but the skill set is the same. You want to be able to tell the story. You want to be able to deliver the news. You want to be able to deliver what your audience expects of you in whatever format you're given. And, there are certain elements of training, how to reset when you're on a talk show, how to write a package, whether it's about the Steelers draft or whether it's about who won the mayoral race, in 90 seconds when it's one of the biggest stories of the year. There are fundamental elements that you have to have an appreciation for and a grasp of, that transfer to whatever medium you're in. And I think, to go back to the earlier point about how you diversify, if you can do that in a 30-second voicer, or you can do that over 4 hours of a talk show, then maybe you're fit for this business, especially nowadays in 2022, where you've got to do a little of all that.
And, going into podcasting, can you talk a little bit about going into that medium and what does it really take to run a successful podcast and how you started getting into that realm?
Yeah. I saw that one come up on the question and answer, and I don't know if I'm the best person to ask that or if I'm the most fit to answer it, because I've not had to do it full time. I did a little of it full time for about a year, 2 years, maybe, when I was working with DK Pittsburgh Sports. And there's that aspect of, if you're going to go into it full time, you got to sell yourself. And I think the single biggest change for kids who are in this business, getting into this business now, as opposed to when I cracked into it in the early 90s, is you weren't asked as much back then to sell yourself. You found a stable company, you went to a stable radio, TV station, stable newspaper outlet, even back then, a stable online outlet, and you helped them sell the product with your content. Now you're selling your own content. And honestly, I hated the sales element of it. I don't want to do the sales element again. If I have to someday, maybe I will. But I think now more than ever, with getting your personality out there on Twitter, with making yourself your own marketable entity, that's the biggest thing, I think, if you're going to go in the podcast realm. What makes you different in a sea of content that people can find? How do you make yourself stand out? How do you make yourself stand out to listeners, to viewers, to advertisers that will put money in your pocket for the work that you do to make this your full-time job? Some people can just podcast as a hobby. Some people can just turn it, like, a lot of the athletes that do podcasts now that are successful, they've got the luxury of, well, they've also got $15 million contracts, or they've got a pension and a retirement fund from the National Football League that they're sitting on. And this is fun. This is their way to stay relevant. This is their way to stay tied into the business. And you're seeing more and more of these kind of podcasts dominate the field. But that's not what a lot of people on the screen are going to have the advantage of doing. You've got to make yourself stand out. You've got to be able to sell your stuff, your content, sell yourself, and also have an understanding of the business aspects of what's going to make this profitable for you.
Thanks. I'd like to kind of loop in a question. Several people had this sort of question. So shortly after school, or right when you were starting your career, what were some setbacks that you had, and how did you overcome them? What were some of the biggest challenges that you saw, and how did you tackle the challenges right in the beginning of your career?
It's funny. I actually think there were more difficult decisions and harder challenges as I got older. I was lucky in the sense that I went to a university that, as soon as you graduated from it in broadcasting, you had a lot of contacts. I went to Syracuse, which is pretty highly regarded in terms of its broadcasting program, and more importantly than how they teach you there, one thing that they encourage and one thing that's very good about it is the contacts that you make within the business, because so many people went into it out of that school. I had opportunities. I was also fortunate that, at my college radio station, they liked me. I did a good enough job there in a sports capacity that they hired me on full time in a news capacity. So that paid the bills. I remember I was making $32,000 coming out of Syracuse when I was 18 and a half years old. And I felt like I was the richest guy in America. $32,000 when you're 18 in Syracuse, New York, back in 1996 went a hell of a long way. You could live a pretty good life. And the good thing about that was it lined my pockets while I could still dabble in sports. I did some sportscasts at another station. I did some TV work on the side, and that was great. I mean, the biggest challenge I had when I was 18 to 21 years old was, I should have said 21, not 18. I started college at 18. The biggest challenge I had was trying to find a 25th hour in the day. I just didn't have enough time to squeeze it all in. But, I guess one early challenge that I had was to make a decision, which was I was living at that time what felt like a pretty comfortable life, and I felt like I could do a lot of stuff that I wanted to do, or I had a job opportunity in Salt Lake City to go into sports full time, which was half of my pay. Did I want to load up my Honda Civic and drive all the way across the country to Utah for $19,000 a year to be a producer, not an on-air talent, for 5 days a week, and then just host a weekend show? And the answer was yes, I did, because this is my crack at 22 to get into sports radio full time. And you just didn't say no to jobs like that back then. So that's what I did. But from there, you make contacts, and you take those contacts and you build on them, and you cultivate them, and you get a phone call a couple of years later in a bigger market in Columbus, Ohio, and you take that job because it gets you close to Pittsburgh, because that's where you've always wanted to be. And then that guy who hired you just so happens to have gotten a job in Pittsburgh 18 months later. And wouldn't you know that you did a good job in Columbus, so they want to bring you to Pittsburgh. And, for the most part, I've been here for 20 years ever since. But like I said before, that I think sometimes the tougher challenges, especially nowadays with the sports broadcasting medium being as diversified as it is, you have to decide, do I want to stay with this job? Do I want to stay with this company, or do I want to go with this competing company? I had to make a really difficult choice once to go to Boston because it was a hell of a lot of money. I was coming to the end of my deal. There were some things shaking up the radio station I was at, and I took that job in Boston, and I thought I was doing the right thing. I was still married at the time. My wife stayed back here in Pittsburgh. I had to go out to Boston solo. It was a strain in our marriage. The money was great, but I was paying a mortgage back in Pittsburgh and renting in Boston. If anybody's tried to rent in Boston, try to walk that tightrope, all of a sudden that money disappears real quick. And it was a bad decision. I shouldn't have done it. I was happier in Pittsburgh. Sometimes you can't put a price on covering the teams and covering the content you care about. I tried to put a price on that, and I whiffed. I never should have done it. And, that's a life lesson that I needed to wait until I was 30 something years old to learn. So, to go to your earlier questions, you never know when those more difficult tipping points in your life and in your career are going to come. Sometimes they come when you're 18 or 22. Sometimes they come later in life when you're in your 30s and you've got a family that you got to worry about, and you've got the end of a contract and a station being bought out and a station merging and a bigger market opportunity and a wife staying in one place and a job in another. Like, that's real life stuff that maybe you don't have to deal with when you're 20, and you can load up your Honda and drive to Salt Lake.
Thank you. I'd like to talk a little bit about nurturing relationships. I mentioned that a couple times. Can you give the students any best practices or tips on not just nurturing relationships as far as networking with other people within the industry, producers and, broadcasting, but, coaches, athletes, nurturing and creating relationships on that front?
Yeah, I think that kind of dovetails back with the earlier part of the conversation of knowing what your role is in the job that you have currently. Like, for instance, if you're a beat guy, it's really important to nurture relationships with the coaches, with the executives, with the players, with the agents. So you can break news and you can be up to date when the trade deadline rolls around, or when a contract signing is about to happen, or, when it's time to replace a general manager or a coach. You can be in front of that because you can pick up the phone, or you can text these people and they'll text you back because, you wrote a good story about their client once when they deserve to have a good story written about them. And then when the fit hits the shan for them sometime, maybe they'll be the one to give you the quote first because you treated them fairly earlier. And then there's kind of cultivating the relationships in a different way when you're a talk show host or a columnist, which is more of what I do. And that is, sometimes when there's an angle to a story that other people don't have, that's deemed to be almost like a little bit more salacious or a little bit on the edgy front, somebody will come to you and give you information because they want to get their side of the story out there. And you can say, sources have told me. And so long as you're not lying about it or making it up. Someone's actually told you, that could be a useful tool. You know, if you trust the sourcing of who's giving you the information. So it's different in how you use it, but it's important. And even if you're in a role like me where you write something crappy about somebody one day, but you got to go back in the locker room the next day to get a quote from them because there's another game the next week or there's another game the next day, you know, there is that aspect of having your face in the locker room. So if they want to tell you off, they can tell you off, and then you can tell them back, well, this is why I wrote it. You know, James Harrison wanted to kick the crap out of me one day. You know, didn't mean that I wasn't going to go into the locker room and let him vent if he wanted to vent. He wasn't going to really kick the crap out of me. What was he going to do? Get suspended before the Patriots game? I mean, like, you know,
Yeah.
These are some things you got to figure out as you get a little bit older in the business. But it is important, is an important element, not only in terms of information, but also in terms of when you want to get a guest on, when you need a soundbite to add some texture to story, when you need a quote in a hurry for a longer form piece. It is an important aspect of the job. Absolutely.
Yeah. I'd like to touch a little bit deeper on those two things, because there are some questions that came in around this point. Balancing being a fan and professional, how has balancing those two things while being objective while you're writing on a player or writing on a team. So can you talk a little bit about how you stay objective when you have a passion and a very specific point of view about something?
Yeah, that was never really hard for me. And maybe that's just because I'm inherently a cynical human being. If the teams are playing poorly, that's kind of when I thrive, I feel like. It's the same way I was when I was a fan. I almost enjoyed watching every single game and saying, oh my God, how are they going to blow it? And then being surprised when they won. So, I mean, that's just kind of who I am as a person, I guess. So I've never had a problem taking the fan goggles off to write or talk about sports. You know, it's strange now as opposed to when I was coming up. There's a lot more expected of that almost, I feel like, in sports media today. It's a little disappointing to me that I think the way Twitter and social media has permeated sports broadcasting and sports writing, that there's a sense that you have to please the audience all the time and give them what they want. And I think a lot of people in our business, unfortunately, gear their daily takes or tweets or columns or talk shows opinions to feed that, which I hate. I don't think that should be why we do what we do, is just to give the people what they want, you know, and sometimes that's negativity. You know, I don't think there's a lot of people out there right now in Pittsburgh who want folks going on the radio and say, hey, you know, I think is doing a great job, the Steelers offensive coordinator. Let's talk about that. Like, you know, no one's really saying that these days, but I do think there's that social media thing that, as hardened as we pretend to be in journalism, exists, where we want to be liked. You know, there's that adrenaline boost that everybody gets from seeing tweets that go out and get a couple thousand likes because you butter up to the team or you kiss up to the organization. And that's what the fans want at that moment. And that was never something I had a problem with. I think it's harder for me now than it was then to balance that out, because I see there's so much more of an audience for it than what I thought when I was younger and when there was no Twitter to get instant feedback and reaction like that. And, you know, the unfortunate part to me is I think we're back to where we were maybe, you know, in the 40s and 50s almost, where there's this almost presumption that the hometown media is going to get the teams over and be on their side and almost be like glorified PR. And I hate that. And that's one aspect of this job that has gotten worse for me as I've gotten older, that I don't like. I prefer to just, if they're good, say they're good. If they stink, say they stink, and tell people why. That's how I'll always be.
Yeah. What kind of advice would you have for people that are, you know, just starting out and that are kind of tiptoeing around criticism? So what can you say to them about if you are criticizing, you know, anything when it comes to an athlete or a call or anything else, and still maintain that sort of relationship? Like a moment ago, you said going back in this next day and getting a quote. What are some ways that you can, you know, be honest with the criticism and still maintain those relationships?
Well, one thing I will remind people of is, for as much that exists out there, and for as much as there's a clouded line between the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and, Pittsburgh Steelers now.com, I think a lot of people have trouble figuring out what's what anymore. I think a lot of the people, especially on the opinion side of things, columnists, talk show hosts, you don't stand out if you just give people what they want all the time. If you're just there to tell people what they already think, people don't remember you. I think in an effort to stand out from time to time, you have to go against the grain. And then if you're looking for adulation, and then if you're looking for fan response, and if you're looking to kind of just be liked all the time, well, maybe you can get in that role eventually. But at some point or another, if you want to be in the media business, you're going to have to take a risk and say things that people don't like, because that's what we remember. There's a reason why every political ad is negative. We remember what people say that's negative more than we remember what people say that we already agree with. That guy thinks like me. Of course he does. Who's this jerk who doesn't think like me? I'm going to remember that guy. And especially when you're starting to get your foot in the door, on occasion, you're going to have to take a few risks to stand out. And when you're the guy who's known for being willing to give a dissenting opinion, when you say something that is common to the popular opinion and say that they're doing a good job, then that should stand out to the fans as, well, if that guy's saying something and they're really playing well, then they must be playing well, because he wouldn't say it unless he meant it.
Couple more questions, because we only have a couple more minutes, but I wanted to get into some specifics of when you're on air and you derail, or when you're interviewing somebody. So it's kind of like a two-part question. When you're interviewing somebody, are there any like interviewing best practices or ways to make somebody feel calm? Or what happens if you derail when you're on air?
What happens?
How do you get it back?
If something, oh, okay. Yeah, there's different techniques, I guess. When you're talking free-flowingly, like on a talk show, it's just almost take a break and literally say it. Okay, I lost my train of thought there. Let's get back to, like, be real. If you've got a 4-hour talk show, you're going to screw up. Not everything is going to be the Gettysburg Address. Like, you're going to have some stumbly moments. So be honest with your fan base. I contradicted myself. I shouldn't have said what I said there. Let me get back to the main point, take a breath, and then get back onto whatever notes you might have jotted down, or whatever's the freshest and most readily accessible in your mind to help yourself get back on the straight and narrow of the point that you were making. It's a little bit different in TV. Sometimes it's harder in TV because that stuff often happens and it's out of your control. Like if you're doing a sports cast and, they roll the wrong tape, I'll give you, this is a silly example, but I'll give it to you because I think it speaks to what you're talking about. When I used to fill in at Channel 4 sometimes when I was in that building in Wilkinsburg, when I was at ESPN Pittsburgh. And I was filling in on the sports desk, and, I was talking about a college football game or something. Pitt was playing Syracuse. And I said, all right, Pitt Syracuse today at Heinz Field. Let's take a look at what happened today as the Panthers won 38-13. And all of a sudden, the Greek Food Festival came up on TV. Like the Greek Food Festival tape came up in front of my face. And I'm like, obviously they hit play on the wrong machine. They're playing. I'm supposed to have football highlights, and they're showing me Greek salad and feta cheese. And, I said, okay, well, obviously we went to the wrong spot in Pittsburgh. The Greek Food Festival was taking place in McKees Rocks today. Baklava for everybody. And, have fun with it. Acknowledge it. Something got screwed up. It wasn't your fault. And then they dump out of the tape, and you're laughing about it, and the anchor's laughing about it, and the weather guy's laughing about it. And now you look like you own the situation. Bring it back to your control. Let them catch up in the prompter. You go to your next story. Okay, we'll come back to the Pitt highlights later. Let's get to Penn State. You just, again, take a breath, realize that not everything is going to be the horrible feeling that it feels like in those 5 seconds that feels like an eternity. and just kind of own the situation and the fact that it didn't happen to you. And if you look as calm as possible in that situation, then people will remember that for as much as the fact that the tape got screwed up.
And one kind of last question, and then we can have some, some final thoughts. How were you able to, balance your workload? A lot of broadcasters say that they're like doing multiple tasks and doing, hustling, doing multiple things at one time. How are you able, and what are some best practices, advice to balance workloads when you're taking multiple jobs, multiple roles because you want to break into a field? What are some balancing advice that you could give to the students?
As far as sort of your own personal life versus the business aspect, is that what you're getting at?
Your personal life, the business aspect, and then having multiple roles, multiple jobs, multiple, conflicting schedules, not conflicting, but not having enough time in the day to do everything that you want to do and prioritizing.
So it's funny you ask me that, because I was at the gym before I came on and joined you guys today, and I completely lost track of my workout because I had to schedule 4 more alarms in my phone for tomorrow to remind myself what's going on. So if you can see that, I've got alarms stacked up from literally 5 a.m. tomorrow until, I've got to remind myself to take out the garbage at 10 o'clock tonight. So like, that's my life, right? Set alarms.
Phone alarms.
Use the digital life that you've got in your hand right here and use it to your advantage. It's really tough to keep, like I said, because you make a good point because of everything I said at the outset of the conversation. When you jump from lily pad to lily pad, you got to remember what got you to that lily pad in the first place. You have to honor that job. You have to keep your commitments. You got to keep your interviews. I'm going to be on the air on DVE on Friday morning, getting ready to tell you about what the Penguins or Steelers are doing, going to the bye week, looking at the NFL schedule. And sometime in between those two sportscasts at 8 and 8:30, I'm going to interview the Duquesne coach about the Duquesne football game I'm calling on Saturday. So you got to be able to switch. You got to be ready at that time to have every ounce of prep at your fingertips. So like today is another good example. I was supposed to interview the other coach. He was supposed to call me at 11:15. He calls me at 10:45. He's like, "Can we do it now?" I'm in the middle of doing something else. You got to stop that, open up a different file, get your phone set up so you can record that interview, bring up the 2 deep chart that you're going to do in 15 minutes to have that in front of you, and just be ready. Have enough prep at your fingertips that if something goes awry, you're at least working from a solid base, that you don't feel like an idiot when you're interviewing somebody, or you got to get there because a little bit late because there's traffic on the 4-Pit Bridge.
Yeah. So over prepping to be able to multitask and, put out those sorts of fires if need be. Yeah. Thank you. If we
Very
could,
important word.
Yeah.
A very important word I learned was osmosis. You pick up stuff kind of through the ether.
Yeah.
You pick up stuff through the atmosphere. If you never allow yourself to be totally off, you're always bringing in information, and that's not a bad thing.
Yeah. Any final thoughts to the class?
No, don't let people say you're crazy for getting in this business. Just know what you're getting into. I try to not tell that to people who are in this business. I know a lot of my peers will do that. I think a lot of my peers do that, and I have a tendency to feel like I want to do that because we don't know what it's going to become. There's nobody who hired me for any job in the late 90s or early 2000s that had any idea what the sports landscape was going to look like after Twitter came around in like 2008 or 2009.
Yeah.
Nobody knew. It's going to change a lot in the next 10 years. Be amenable, be flexible, be malleable, and learn how to promote yourself. That's the one thing, if I had to do it all over again, I'd have a better appreciation and understanding about self-promotion and learning how to do that for myself when I was 21, getting into the business, as opposed to having to figure that out when I'm in my late 30s, early 40s. And it's more about how you get yourself out there instead of what your TV station, your newspaper, your website, your radio station was supposed to be doing for you when they hired you. Yeah. That's the biggest dynamic change I've seen. And that's the one that I think that people will have to understand the most. But you can get in this business if you're willing to make the business work for you. And that wasn't always as easily streamlined of a thought to understand back in the 90s. It's something everybody has to understand now.
Yeah. When you were just starting out or going into, I guess, in mid-20s or right after college, how are you able to find your own voice and brand, like your own personality, on-air personality? How did that
Yeah,
develop?
well, okay. Yeah, that's very different because no one used that phrase when I came out of college, your own brand. You know, like when Juju Smith-Schuster came to the Steelers as a rookie and started using the phrase my own brand when he was 20, everybody looked at each other like, we never talked like this. And that didn't make Juju wrong. That just made it different. That was a generation gap thing. Nobody talked about your own brand really, unless you were Bob Costas or Mike Francesa or Chris Mad Dog Russo or somebody like that back then. You're a big time. You had a brand. If not, you were trying to do a job. You were doing something for a station. But yeah, I mean, how did I find myself? You know, I probably found myself when I was working at the X more than anything else. You know, like whatever edge, whatever sarcasm, whatever tone I had when I would cover sports and talk about them in a sports aspect. When I found like I had more of a broad base to do it when I was doing the morning show, which was sex, drugs, rock and roll, and sports, you know, you allowed yourself to have your personality be into the sports part. And when I decided I wanted to go back into sports full time, I brought a lot of that with me so that I wasn't afraid to let people know who I was when I was talking about sports.
Oh, thank you. We have less than a minute. Thank you so much for your time, Tim Benz. Thank you. We appreciated this half hour.
Yeah, anytime. And if anybody, give them my email. I'll answer any questions people want.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
All right. See ya.
All right,
Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks.
Nothing like that. Who? I knew it was like the